The white lace of Clara's wedding dress felt like a cage, cutting tightly into her heavy arms and full waist. Her hands shook so violently that the stems of the wild prairie roses in her bouquet snapped one by one. The entire congregation of Oak Haven sat in the wooden pews, their eyes boring into her back like hot irons. Pastor Thomas cleared his throat, raising his heavy Bible, ready to speak the final vows. Suddenly, Julian stepped back from the altar, dropping Clara's hand as if her skin had turned to ash. He wiped his palms on his black vest, a cold, calculated sneer twisting his lips. "I cannot go through with this farce," Julian announced, his voice ringing through the rafters of the small church. "I refuse to bind my name and my future to this fat, pathetic loser." A sharp, collective gasp sucked the air right out of the room, followed by a suffocating, heavy silence. Clara felt the blood drain from her face, her cheeks burning hot beneath her cheap lace veil. Julian turned away from her completely, facing the crowd with his chin held high, gesturing toward Clara's full hips and heavy frame. "Look at her. She can barely squeeze into a wedding gown, and she expects me to spend my life dragging her weight around." From the third row, Evelyn, the banker's slender daughter, smirked behind her silk fan, her eyes flashing with cruel victory. Julian smiled back at her, making it clear to everyone in the room that a secret deal had already been made. "I am a man of ambition, and I belong with a woman of status," Julian shouted, his words echoing off the wooden walls. "I am marrying Evelyn, and Clara can keep her pathetic pennies and her miserable, lonely life." The church erupted into a wave of harsh, mocking laughter that crashed over Clara like a tidal wave. Someone in the back row made a crude joke about the floorboards groaning under her weight, causing another wave of giggles. Tears cut hot, wet tracks through the thick dust on Clara's face as she dropped her broken bouquet to the floor. She looked down at her worn leather boots, peeking out from under the white hem, wishing the earth would open up and swallow her whole. She was completely alone, utterly ruined, and publicly discarded in front of everyone she had ever known. She turned to flee down the aisle, her head bowed in deep, suffocating shame. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the church didn't just open, they banged against the stone walls with a deafening crack. The laughter died instantly, choking in the throats of the cruel townspeople. A tall, broad-shouldered figure stepped out of the shadows of the back pew, his silver spurs clinking rhythmically against the floorboards. It was Ethan Vance, the most powerful, feared, and wealthy rancher in the entire territory. His black Stetson hat was pulled low, shading eyes that were rumored to be made of cold, unyielding iron. He didn't look at the crowd. His intense, dark gaze was locked entirely on Clara's trembling form. Ethan strode down the center aisle with a slow, dangerous grace, the heavy leather of his gun belt creaking with every step. The townspeople shrunk back into their seats, terrified to even breathe in his presence. He reached the front of the altar and stopped directly in front of a trembling, pale Julian. Without saying a single word, Ethan reached out his gloved hand and brutally ripped the white wedding flower right off Julian's lapel. Julian staggered back, his face turning a sickly shade of white as he swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. "Mr. Vance, what is the meaning of this? This is my wedding day." "You don't deserve the air she breathes, let alone her hand," Ethan said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that vibrated through the floor. He pinned the white flower onto his own dark leather vest with slow, deliberate movements. Ethan then turned his massive frame toward the trembling pastor, who was clutching his Bible like a shield. "Change the groom's name on that certificate to Ethan Vance," the rancher commanded. The pastor's jaw dropped, his hands shaking as he looked from Ethan to the weeping bride. "But, Mr. Vance, the vows, the family, the town." "I said change the name and proceed with the service immediately," Ethan growled, his hand resting casually on the pearl handle of his revolver. "This woman is coming home with me as my wife." Before we reveal the shocking words he whispered into her ear that changed her life forever, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a single moment of this sweeping frontier romance. Ethan turned away from the trembling pastor and stepped closer to Clara, his massive chest nearly touching her wet cheek. He reached out with a gloved hand and gently lifted the heavy lace veil away from her face, exposing her red, tear-streaked eyes to the entire room. "Lean your weight on me, Clara," Ethan whispered, his deep voice carrying a strange, fierce warmth that only she could hear. "I build my empires on solid rock, not on thin twigs, and you are exactly the woman I want by my side." Clara gasped, her heart hammering against her ribs as she looked into his dark, unyielding eyes. She expected to see pity or mockery, but there was only a burning, protective intensity that made her knees feel weak. The pastor's pen scratched frantically against the official marriage ledger, his fingers slick with sweat as he crossed out Julian's name. He dipped the tip into the inkwell, his voice cracking as he looked up at the towering rancher. "The paperwork is amended, Mr. Vance," the pastor stuttered, clearing his throat loudly. "By the power vested in me by this territory, I now pronounce you man and wife." Ethan didn't wait for a celebration or a cheer from the silent, stunned congregation. He grabbed Clara's thick, shaking hand in his own broad palm and led her firmly down the aisle, his spurs striking the wood like a declaration of war. Julian took a step forward, his face twisted in a desperate mixture of panic and greed as he realized what he had just thrown away. "Wait, Ethan, you can't just take her. She owes money to the town store. She's a burden." Ethan stopped dead in his tracks just 3 feet from the church doors, turning his head just enough to show his razor-sharp jawline. "If you speak her name again, Julian, I will bury you under the dirt you walk on," the rancher warned quietly. Julian flinched, stepping back into the shadow of the banker's daughter, his mouth shutting instantly as a cold sweat broke out across his forehead. Clara felt a strange, unfamiliar spark of hope bloom in her chest as Ethan pushed open the heavy oak doors, leading her out into the bright afternoon sun. A massive, black-painted carriage drawn by 4 magnificent horses stood waiting at the hitching post. Ethan lifted Clara by her waist, effortlessly hoisting her full frame up onto the plush leather seat without a single hint of strain. He climbed up beside her, took the leather reins in his hands, and snapped them loudly, sending the carriage flying down the dusty main street of Oakhaven. The wind caught Clara's torn veil, ripping it away into the dirt as they left the mocking laughter of the townspeople far behind them. As the small wooden buildings melted into the endless, rolling hills of the prairie, Clara looked down at her hands, still trembling in her lap. She was no longer Clara, the forgotten seamstress, the girl who was too big, too poor, and too clumsy for the world. She was now Mrs. Ethan Vance, the wife of the most powerful man in the territory. But the fear in her heart remained as vast as the open sky. She didn't know what awaited her at the Vance Empire, or why a man who could have anyone had chosen to rescue a broken, plus-size bride. The carriage rolled deep into the rugged hills, leaving the dust of Oakhaven far behind. But the ghost of Julian's cruel words still echoed in Clara's ears. She pressed her back against the leather seat, pulling her arms tightly against her full stomach to make herself take up less space. Every bumpy mile reminded her of the life she was leaving behind, a life spent in a tiny, drafty shack at the edge of town, where she worked until her fingers bled. She remembered the whispers at the town well, the way the merchants' wives would look at her thick waist and laughingly suggest she buy extra fabric just to cover her shame. Julian had used that shame like a whip, forcing her to sew his shirts and cook his meals for months while he secretly courted the banker's daughter. He had called her a burden, a heavy beast of burden, and the whole town had agreed with him by laughing in her face at the altar. Clara sneaked a glance at the stoic man sitting beside her, his large hands guiding the horses with effortless power. Ethan Vance didn't look like a savior. He looked like a storm wrapped in black leather and iron, his jaw set in a hard, unreadable line. She opened her mouth to speak, to ask him why he had bound his wealthy name to a ruined, plus-size woman, but the words choked in her throat. She looked down at her cheap wedding dress, the seams straining against her heavy thighs, feeling entirely out of place in his grand carriage. The horses slowed to a walk as they passed through a massive, arched wooden gate bearing the brand of a flaming lone star. Spread out before them was the Vance Empire, a sprawling kingdom of green pastures, thousands of cattle, and a magnificent two-story stone manor. Dozens of rugged ranch hands stopped their work, pulling off their hats in stunned silence as the carriage drove past the barns. They stared open-mouthed at Clara, their eyes widening as they recognized the full-figured woman from town sitting in the place of honor. Ethan brought the carriage to a smooth halt right in front of the grand porch of the main house. He leaped down to the dirt, walked around to Clara's side, and held out his broad, calloused hand to help her down. Clara hesitated, her fingers clutching the wooden frame of the seat as she looked at the grand front doors of her new home. "This is a mistake, Mr. Vance," she whispered, her voice cracking as a tear threatened to spill over her thick eyelashes. "I am not the kind of woman who belongs in a house like this. Look at me. I will only bring you ridicule," Clara said, her chin trembling. "The people in town will mock you for marrying the fat seamstress who couldn't even keep a poor clerk." Ethan didn't argue, and he didn't move his hand. He simply stepped closer, his shadow completely enveloping her trembling body. "I don't care about the opinions of sheep, Clara, and I don't make mistakes," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding rumble. He reached up, took her by her thick waist with both hands, and lifted her down from the carriage as easily as if she were a feather. His grip was firm, holding her close against his massive chest for a second longer than necessary, letting her feel the solid, unyielding heat of his body. "Welcome to your sanctuary, Clara," Ethan said, his dark eyes locking onto hers as he finally released her waist. "From this moment on, no one in this territory will ever make you feel small again." Ethan walked her up the wide wooden steps of the grand porch, his large hand resting firmly on the small of her back. The solid weight of his palm felt like an anchor, grounding her shaking legs as he pushed open the massive oak front doors. The interior of the manor was breathtaking, with high cedar ceilings, polished hardwood floors, and a massive stone fireplace that cast a warm, golden glow across the room. Clara stepped onto a thick, expensive wool rug, her breath catching as she realized this grand house was now supposed to be her home. A sharp, painful memory flashed in her mind of the day she had first met Ethan, weeks before the disaster at the altar. It had been during the worst blizzard of the winter, when a blinding wall of white ice had trapped Oakhaven in a freezing grip. Clara had been walking back from delivering a heavy load of laundry, her boots sinking deep into the snow as she struggled against the freezing wind. Near the edge of the woods, she had heard a faint, desperate cry coming from the abandoned, rotting mineshaft that everyone in town avoided. Without a second thought for her own safety, Clara had dragged her heavy frame through the deep drifts toward the sound. Peering down into the dark, crumbling hole, she had seen Ethan's 8-year-old niece, Lily, trapped on a collapsing wooden ledge, sobbing in terror as the ice cracked around her. The townspeople always called Clara clumsy and slow because of her size, but in that moment, her full-figured body became her greatest strength. She had dropped to her knees in the freezing mud, anchoring her heavy weight against a solid pine tree, and reached her thick, strong arms deep into the shaft. Lily had clutched her small hands around Clara's wrists, and Clara had pulled with every ounce of power in her body, her muscles screaming as she hoisted the girl out of the dark earth just before the ledge collapsed into the abyss. Clara had wrapped the shivering child in her own heavy wool shawl, shielding her from the biting wind with her own body until Ethan and his men tracked them down. Ethan had found them huddled together by the tree, his face pale with a terror that few had ever seen in the stoic rancher. He hadn't spoken much that day, only wrapping both Clara and his niece in his massive buffalo hide coat, but his dark eyes had watched Clara with a profound, unyielding intensity ever since. Now, standing in the warmth of his grand living room, Clara looked down at her hands, the faint scars from that frozen rope still visible on her skin. She realized that while Julian had only seen her as a shameful burden, the powerful rancher standing beside her had seen something entirely different. Ethan closed the heavy front doors behind them, shutting out the rest of the world and the cruel whispers of Oakhaven. He took off his black Stetson hat, tossing it onto a nearby table, and turned his full attention to his new, plus-size bride. "You saved my family when the rest of this town hid behind their locked doors, Clara," Ethan said, his deep voice echoing softly against the high cedar rafters. "I knew then that your heart was grander than anything this territory has ever seen, and I swear on my life, I will protect it." The golden warmth of the fireplace did little to ease the tight knot of anxiety twisting deep in Clara's full stomach. She stood in the center of the vast room, her hands gripping the white lace of her skirt so tightly that her knuckles throbbed. Ethan walked over to a heavy oak sideboard, pouring 2 fingers of amber whiskey into a crystal glass before turning back to look at her. His dark, piercing eyes traveled slowly down her full figure, taking in the way her breath hitched under his intense scrutiny. "You are safe here, Clara," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a low, soothing rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "But you look like a bird waiting for the cage door to slam shut." Clara swallowed hard, her chest heaving as she finally forced herself to meet his gaze, her voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "I am grateful for what you did at the church, Mr. Vance, but I am not blind to how the world works. A man like you does not marry a woman like me out of charity, and you certainly do not need a wife who is the laughingstock of the entire county," she added, a bitter tear escaping her lashes and tracing a path down her flush, round cheek. "Julian said I was a heavy, useless burden, and everyone in that church agreed with him, so I need to know what you truly expect from me in exchange for this shelter." Ethan set his glass down on the table with a slow, deliberate click, his face hardening into an expression of pure, unyielding authority. He strode across the polished floorboards until he was standing directly in front of her, his massive frame blocking out the light of the fire. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers gently cupping her chin, forcing her to lift her head and look into eyes that burned with a fierce, quiet anger. "Look at me, Clara," he commanded softly. "Julian is a fool who traded a diamond for a handful of cheap gravel, and the people of Oakhaven are cowards who fear anything they cannot control or understand. I did not bring you to my ranch to be a servant, and I did not marry you out of pity or a desire for a hidden bargain," Ethan said, his thumb gently wiping away the hot tear on her cheek. He stepped even closer, his broad chest pressing slightly against her full bosom, letting her feel the furious, steady beat of his heart. "I asked you a question in that church, and now I am going to ask you the most important question of your life right here. Are you willing to leave your shame in the dirt of Oakhaven and stand beside me as the true mistress of this empire, trusting that my protection is absolute?" Clara looked deep into his dark eyes, searching for any hint of deceit, but she found only an overwhelming devotion that made her breathless. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her full body trembling as she placed her large, soft hand over his calloused knuckles. "I will trust you, Ethan," Clara whispered, her heart swelling with a strange, powerful courage she hadn't felt in years. "I will stand beside you." Early the next morning, The heavy rumble of wagon wheels woke Clara from a deep, dreamless sleep in the Grand Master bedroom. She wrapped herself in a thick velvet robe and walked out onto the front porch, her heart pounding as she saw Ethan standing in the courtyard. Julian was standing there too, his face pale and sweating as two burly ranch hands held him firmly by his arms. Beside them, the town merchant was frantically unloading boxes of fine silks, wools, and imported velvet onto the porch steps. "I brought the best tailor in the territory, just as you ordered, Mr. Vance," the merchant stammered, bowing his head repeatedly in terror. "He brought every premium fabric from the East Coast, all for your new bride." Ethan didn't look at the merchant. His cold, dark gaze was fixed entirely on Julian, who was trembling so hard his knees knocked together. Julian's eyes darted to Clara, his mouth opening in a desperate plea for mercy. "Clara, please, tell your husband to stop," Julian whimpered, his voice cracking with fear. "He bought up every single one of my banknotes last night. He owns my shop, my land, and my house, and he's throwing me out onto the street." Ethan stepped forward, the heavy silver spurs on his boots clinking like a death knell in the quiet morning air. "You called this woman a financial burden in front of God and the whole town, Julian," Ethan growled, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "So I decided to relieve you of all your earthly burdens by taking everything you own. And if I ever see your pathetic face in Oakhaven again, I will personally ensure you are buried under it." Ethan waved his hand, and the ranch hands roughly shoved Julian toward the main gate, forcing him to march down the dusty road with nothing but the clothes on his back. Julian sobbed open-mouthed, completely ruined, his future destroyed in a single morning. Ethan turned away from the road and looked up at Clara, his hard expression softening into something incredibly warm as he walked up the porch steps toward her. The traveling tailor immediately stepped forward, holding up a tape measure with a nervous smile. "We will need her exact measurements, Mr. Vance," the tailor said, glancing at Clara's full, curvy frame. "Should we design something to hide her, to minimize her shape for the town functions?" "No," Ethan commanded loudly, his broad hand coming down firmly on Clara's plush hip, drawing her tightly against his massive torso. "You will cut these dresses from the finest silks, and you will design them to celebrate every single beautiful curve on her body. My wife is a queen, and she will be dressed like one," Ethan said, his intense dark eyes locking onto Clara's flushed face. For the first time in her entire life, as she looked at the mountain of expensive silk bought just for her, Clara felt truly beautiful, desired, and fiercely protected. 3 days later, the peace of the sanctuary was shattered by the sound of furious shouting near the eastern pastures. Clara hurried out to the grand porch, her heart hammering against her ribs as she saw a massive column of black smoke rising against the blue sky. Julian, driven mad by his sudden ruin, had broken onto the ranch under the cover of dawn alongside the corrupt town banker and 3 hired thugs. They had thrown burning torches into the hay barns and were now trying to poison the main water spring that fed the entire Vance cattle herd. Ethan was out on the far northern range, miles away from the main house, leaving Clara and a few older ranch hands alone on the property. Clara didn't hesitate. She threw on her thick leather boots and grabbed the heavy double-barreled shotgun hanging above the mantel, her face hardening with a fierce determination. She ran toward the burning barns, her full figure moving with an aggressive, powerful speed that shocked the old hands who were struggling to contain the flames. She found Julian standing near the wooden water valve, a heavy metal wrench in his hands as he prepared to smash the line and pour a jar of dark lye into the reservoir. "Drop it, Julian," Clara roared, her voice echoing across the courtyard as she raised the heavy shotgun, leveling the cold iron barrels straight at his chest. Julian spun around, his face twisting into a hideous, desperate sneer when he saw her. "You think you're a lady now just because you wear silk, you fat cow?" Julian shrieked, taking a menacing step toward her with the raised wrench. "This ranch belongs to a real man, and I am going to take back everything he stole from me." Before he could take another step, a thunderous roar echoed from the tree line as Ethan's massive black stallion charged into the courtyard, kicking up a blinding cloud of dust. Ethan leaped from the saddle before the horse had even stopped, his face a mask of pure, terrifying frontier rage. He didn't speak a single word. He simply strode forward, gripped Julian by the throat with one massive gloved hand, and lifted him completely off the ground. Julian gasped for air, his legs kicking wildly in the air as his face turned a deep, suffocating purple under the rancher's iron grip. Ethan slammed him brutally against the stone wall of the well, the impact shattering the jar of poison on the rocks below. The three hired thugs took one look at Ethan's burning, murderous eyes, dropped their weapons into the dirt, and raised their hands in absolute terror. "The frontier has a very short trial for men who burn barns and poison water, Julian," Ethan whispered, his voice dropping to a low, deadly growl that made everyone present freeze. "You are going to jail for the rest of your miserable life. And if you ever look at my wife again, the law won't be able to save you from me." Ethan turned his head toward Clara, his chest heaving as his dark eyes scanned her from head to toe, checking every inch of her full body for harm. When he saw her standing tall, holding the heavy shotgun with a steady, unbreakable grip, a look of profound pride and fierce devotion washed over his rugged face. The following Saturday, the grand iron gates of the Vance estate were thrown wide open for the first time in 10 years. Lanterns hung from every oak tree, casting a magnificent golden glow over hundreds of guests who had traveled from all corners of the territory to witness the grand ball. The entire population of Oakhaven arrived in their finest suits and waistcoats, their faces pale with an uneasy mixture of curiosity and deep apprehension. They gathered around the massive wooden dance floor in the courtyard, whispering anxiously as they waited to see the new mistress of the empire. Evelyn, the banker's daughter, stood near the refreshments in a plain, faded dress, her family completely bankrupt after her father's corrupt schemes had been exposed to the territorial marshal. She watched the grand staircase of the manor with bitter, tearful eyes, knowing she would never step foot inside that house again. Suddenly, the grand double doors of the mansion swung open, and the crowd fell into a stunned, breathless silence that stretched across the entire courtyard. Ethan Vance stepped out onto the veranda, looking incredibly sharp in a tailored black suit, his dark eyes scanning the crowd with cold authority. He extended his broad, gloved hand toward the doorway, and Clara stepped out into the light, causing a collective gasp to echo through the crowd. She was wearing a magnificent gown of deep, midnight blue silk, custom designed to hug her full waist and flow elegantly over her gorgeous plus-size curves. The rich fabric caught the light of the lanterns, highlighting the beautiful fullness of her figure and making her look like an absolute queen of the frontier. She held her head high, her skin glowing, and her full lips curved into a confident, radiant smile that completely captivated every person in attendance. Ethan stepped down the stairs beside her, his large hand resting protectively on her waist as he led her directly to the center of the crowded courtyard. He looked out over the faces of the townspeople who had once mocked her, his voice booming like thunder through the quiet night. "I want to make something entirely clear to everyone standing on my land tonight," Ethan announced, his deep baritone echoing off the stone walls of the manor. "This is Clara Vance, my beautiful wife, and the true sole mistress of the entire Vance empire. Every cattle hand, every acre of land, and every ounce of gold I own belongs to her, and an injury to her will bring the absolute wrath of my name down upon you," he added, his dark eyes locking onto the trembling merchants from town. The crowd erupted into a loud, roaring applause, the townspeople practically tripping over themselves to bow their heads and show their deepest respect to the woman they had once discarded. Clara looked up at her husband, her heart overflowing with a fierce, profound happiness as he pulled her thick frame close against his chest for their first dance. She was no longer the broken, lonely girl from Oakhaven. She was the undisputed queen of the grandest ranch in the West, loved and protected for exactly who she was. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes at that altar? Would you have accepted Ethan's hand, or fled from the town completely? Let us know in the comments below.